World of sport, the sport of kings, it's sometimes known as. The rules on how often jockeys can whip their horses are to be changed after some controversy about excessive use of the whip in this year's Grand National.
Well, some animal welfare groups have called for an outright ban, claiming it's painful and cruel. The British Horse Racing Authority says it is appropriate when it's done properly, but it will tighten the rules, especially during the closing stages of a race.
Well, with us now is Professor Tim Morris, who led the research, and Lee Mottershead, who's a journalist at Racing Post, the
Hello.
racing newspaper.
Good morning.
Good morning to you both. This really, jockeys have been using the whip on the horses, of course, for years, but it really became a big issue at the Grand National this year. Why?
It did, because the Grand National really, Bill, is the only race that the wider public take an interest in within horse racing. It gets 10 million viewers on the BBC, it's shown around the world, and there's mass media coverage. So this year's Grand National was unfortunate in the regard that 2 horses died, and we had the winning jockey receiving a 5-day whip ban, and the media picked up on that and ran with it.
You've brought, Professor Morris, some examples of whips that are used at the moment in horse racing.
Yes.
Can you tell us what effect that would have?
This is a energy-absorbing padded whip. I think you can see that. Very different from what people might imagine it to be.
So it's soft at the top?
Well, it's soft all the way down.
Right.
And jockeys are only allowed to use it in certain places and a certain frequency. And we've tightened that up to make sure there's no ambiguity about the limited number of times, 7 or 8 times, depending on the type of race.
7 or 8 times throughout the course of the race?
Yes, total. That's the total. And anything above that, they'll get a penalty. Previously, the penalty started with a caution. Now it's going to start with a 5-day ban.
Can a horse feel pain?
It can feel pain, but not from this whip. We
Why
don't
not?
believe. 2 reasons. One, the design of the whip. As you can see, it's very different from a narrow, old-fashioned whippy whip. And the second thing is, during a race, the horse is in a very different physiological and mental state to a horse that's resting. It's just like when you're on the sports field and you come off and think, what's that ache there? I've injured myself, I don't realise. It's a totally different circumstances than at rest.
Right. Lee, what are jockeys and trainers likely to say to having a limit of 7 or 8 cracks of the whip in a race?
I think they'll be broadly supportive, and they should be too. As Tim says, the whip in itself isn't inherently cruel if it's used correctly. However, the public doesn't like to see horses being struck in the name of sport, and therefore jockeys that break the rules, flout the rules, there needs to be a significant deterrent for them. There now is, and that's important. So not because the whip is cruel, but because the public's perception of the sport is vital if the sport is going to be maintained and to flourish, and therefore there needs to be that deterrent. Previously there really wasn't. It was wishy-washy. Now it's not. It's clear, it's defined, and jockeys really will be hit hard for breaking the rules.
Right. If horses don't feel pain and don't really feel the effects of it, why use it in the first place?
Well, they do feel it, but they don't feel pain. Pain is counterproductive. You've heard the proverb, you can take a horse to water but can't make it drink. If you're cruel to a horse, it's not going to perform properly. We believe excessive whip use is not only wrong, but counterproductive.
Can I just have a look at one of these? Why not ban the use of the whip altogether? Because then it's a level playing field for everybody, isn't it?
Well, the reason we didn't ban it is because we asked 2 questions. One, jockeys, why do you need the whip? And second, then we asked animal welfare groups, is it cruel? By the way, animal welfare groups have not told us in defined circumstances that the whip is cruel. Animal rights group are claiming it's cruel, but that's a different matter. That's because they're against racing. But jockeys have said they need the whip for safety and to get the best performance to a horse.
Why for safety?
If you're on a half-ton horse going at nearly 40 miles an hour over a jump and there are 20 other horses around you, you need a tool to steer, correct its stride, rebalance the horse. It's a very risky sport. It's one of the most risky sports there is, and we've got to look after jockey safety.
And that's a wider issue, Lee. Some people will be saying, never mind the whip. What about the steeplechasing altogether? Because we see horses falling horribly in races, and you mentioned 2 horses died in the Grand National this year.
Yeah, I mean, that is a wider issue that racing has constantly faced, and the Grand National in particular. Those that get involved in racing do so knowing there is a risk, but they deem that risk to be acceptable. And what you have to remember too is that people that become involved in horse racing as jockeys, as trainers, invariably do so because they have a love of horses. They do it because they love horses, and they wouldn't be involved in the sport if they thought that sport was inherently cruel to the animals they're working with.
All right, Lee. Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor
You better
Morris.
have that back.
Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting.